Hi, this is Mrs. Warren coming back to you for part two of Andrew Jackson's notes. Uh, Prior to this, we learned about Jackson's rise to fame, I guess you could say, about his young life, and the election of 1824, which he got the corrupt bargain the presidency stole from him, as well as the election of 1828, where he finally won as the hero of the common man, as well as what he did first thing getting into the presidency and a little bit throughout and firing everybody and giving them government positions that supported him, called the spoil system. We're going to concentrate on three major events in Jackson's presidency today. First, keeping the Union together. There was definitely a divide between people who believed in federal power and people who believed in states' rights. That had never really been resolved from the very beginning. If you remember back about the first two political parties, the Democratic Republicans by Jefferson and the Federalists Alexander Hamilton led. We were then concentrating on the Bank of the United States. The National Bank was a bank that was able to give loans to businesses, and Jackson believed that they just had way too much power and they were a little bit corrupt and not on the side of the common man. And last, as you learned, the Indian Removal Act. And, let's not forget Farmer McPoor over there that says, oh man, he's a big supporter of Jackson. All these seems great. And of course, Mr. Featherbottom that thinks all these seem awful. But before we start, let's do a brain snack. All right, let's ponder for a minute. At this time, on the left-hand side of your notebook, you will respond to this activity. It says, a new rule has been implemented to make lunch less chaotic. From now on, we will excuse to lunch by wing or department, each 5 minutes after the last. Let's say the history wing will go last. What if the history wing choose to ignore this rule? What do you think would happen to them if they did, and they went whenever they wanted to? Ponder this for a moment. Write your response on the left-hand side. Pause this video to respond. Great class discussion. Now let's go on to the next part, which kind of has something to do with this. Now, we've talked about protective tariffs. Okay, so let's go over this one again. In 1828, there was a huge protective tariff. And as we already know, the North hated protective tariffs. It really hurt the South. But as you know from an Industrial Revolution, it really helped Northern factories. People were less likely to buy British cloth and more likely to buy American cloth, which was good for our economy. But John C. Calhoun, the vice president, Jackson's vice president, believed this law was unconstitutional. And he supported states' rights. He said, oh no, the South has the right to say no to this law. And because the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights says that, we are to protect our states' rights, we don't have to follow this law. Now, Jackson, he was not cool about this. He was a big federal guy, as you know about the power that he really liked when he got in there. He took the power of the presidency a little bit too far in some cases. So we come to a problem called the Nullification Crisis, and this is keeping the Union together. South Carolina, which John C. Calhoun was from, threatened to secede from the U.S. over an unfair tariff. Now we know that secede, you learn this in 7th grade, means to remove itself from the actual whole country, and that they were going to just throw the Constitution out the window. They said they nullified the tariff. They declared it unconstitutional and refused to enforce it because it hurt the South. Jackson got Congress to lower the tariff, but he was ready to go down there and take the army by force and collect it if necessary. He insisted that he was in charge. Now, this kind of sounds like the beginning of the Civil War, but it's not, because it's only 1832. So, what happens? Well, Henry Clay, which you all know from the election of 1824, he comes up with a compromise, and South Carolina decided to stay. But his own vice president, John C. Calhoun, resigned. He's like, he couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand being a guy that was all about federal power. He believed in states' rights, so he's out of there. Sounds kind of like a precursor to the Civil War, or maybe a foreshadowing. Because do you remember what is the first state to secede during the Civil War? Yep, you guessed it, South Carolina. But things had calmed down. They reduced the amount of the tariff. Life went on. At this time, please stop the video and click here for an amusing video cartoon, one of my favorites that I think you're going to really like. One more thing. Don't forget, we're still we can't make a decision. Who's in charge? The federal government or the states? How is this going to play out? Pause here. Gotta love the video. Great villain. Loving the robot. Okay, let's move on. Nullification Crisis was huge. It's going to play in the minds of America. The states believed, I'm practically grown, I can do and feel whatever I want to, I can leave if I want. And of course the federal government's like the dad going, you're a part of this household and you'll follow my rules or else. As you can see, this is going to lead to a problem in the future. This is just the beginning, folks. All right, let's get to Indian removal. Now, you already had a little experience with Indian removal. Sorry we played a trick on you, but it was fun. Now, here's what happened. In the southeast of America, Georgia, Alabama, and several other states in the Union that still had Cherokee and several other tribes living with lands with treaties, they wanted their land. There's gold supposedly found on it. The idea of the profit on cotton for farming. And of course, there were skirmishes between the Indians and the whites. So Andrew Jackson said, you know what? I have a solution. Now, he said that Congress would buy the land, but the Supreme Court said, oh no, wait a minute. You have an agreement with the Indians. You can't buy the land. That's unconstitutional. Jackson ignored the court, and this was a court case called Worcester versus Georgia. And he went ahead with the plans anyway. So this kind of shows you that Andrew is abusing his power. If you look up at the quote up here, John Marshall, who's the Supreme Court justice, said, that Jackson couldn't do it. It's illegal. According to judicial review, the Supreme Court should, that's it. That's all he can do. Jackson came back and said, oh yeah, John Marshall? You've made your decision. Let's see if you can enforce it. And of course he couldn't. We didn't have the support of the whole government. Everybody wanted the Indians removed. So he goes on. Ignoring the Supreme Court. Oh, feather bottom. Georgia forced the Cherokee to leave leading to the Trail of Tears. Now, the Trail of Tears involves several different tribes, just not the Cherokee. The Cherokee was the largest amount of people that went, that were forcibly moved to the West by gunpoint. They were first put into concentration camps until they got them all together. Any leaders that they thought would be a problem, they put them in chains. And again, some of them were removed so quickly from their homes that they couldn't get all their possessions, while the whites later on came in and pillaged whatever they had to leave behind. This journey took several months, and it was extremely terrible for these people, because everything that they depended on, their food, their clothing, their medicines, all came from the natural areas they lived in for thousands of years. And now they were being removed to a state that we know now as Oklahoma and Nebraska, and they were crunched together in a land that was dry and arid and not good for agriculture, and it was not good. And again, the federal government forced Native Americans to resettle west of the Mississippi, allowing the white settlers to take their land. The court case I spoke of earlier, Worcester versus Georgia, the Cherokee in Georgia and Alabama challenged the act, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor. Jackson refuses to enforce the ruling, which led to what is now known as the Trail of Tears. As I said before, the Army gathered up 15,000 Cherokee men and women and children. Now, this was just one tribe. There were thousands more from the other tribes you saw on the map earlier. But 4,000 of them died. Lack of food, warm clothing. See, remember yesterday that State of the Union address he gave the Congress? Saying that, oh, we'll pay for everything. Oh, we'll give them provisions on their way to the trip. Oh, we're going to provide them. Yeah, the money never came through. So at first they were taken care of with plenty of food, but not shortly into the rest of their journey, there wasn't much to do. They couldn't even bury their dead on the side. And you'll be watching a video to show how brutal this act was. Of course, which makes sense that they named it the Trail of Tears, right? Today, they are mostly settled in the state of Oklahoma. Now, this is a video. Well, first, before we get to the video, Red Cloud, which is a very famous Indian leader, and this quote is attributed to Red Cloud. He said, "They made us many promises, more than I can remember, but they kept one. They promised to take our land, and they took it." This was just one instance of Indian removal, and it has been happening and continued to happen after this point. Click this picture for the video. Please advance it to 3 minutes at 30 seconds to make sure we fit it in for the lecture today. Please pause this video, and when you're finished, move on to part 2.